you know, someone from the comptroller's office or something where the request is going, they'll call me back and say, look, you know, we can get you X, Y, and Z in a timely fashion, but some of the other stuff is either going to take a long time, and we're not really sure that it falls under public records. It might be exempt. For a lot of reporters, I mean, the stuff I work on tends to be long-term, so I have a little more time, but I do have a deadline, and certainly general assignment reporters have a deadline. And I just find that we're amenable to having that discussion about how we can, on the fly, alter the request. So, you know, we want to see the documentation. We're willing to, by and large, work with you. And I realize every individual is different. But, you know, we work in the sandbox, and I'd like to do it for a long time. And I think if you can work with the government agency, by and large, we're open to that.
And I think Tim's point is another practical tip to take from this discussion, where a request is being made for several items. If some of those items take more research or there's more of a question, and other items don't, provide what you can. And I think that, you know, if you're providing stuff up front, you're kind of responding the same way that Tony responded to the gentleman with the motor vehicle accident. You're being proactive. You're certainly not even leaving the impression that there's delay or anything of that nature, and there's that discussion that's going on back and forth. And I think that solves a lot of the issues that end up arising.
Just one last thing I should add. For both towns, every denial will come to me. The person that received the request, if it's a denial situation, will always contact the solicitor, and then rely on the solicitor to respond to the internet. If it's going to be denied.
Yeah, all my denials have come from the agency's lawyers.
We've got a couple minutes left over, and I want to get to one other point. Both Sheila and Tim have brought up at various points during this discussion changes. And you know, I highlighted earlier that this is really a discussion, the PowerPoint, and you know, what you're going to have to do after today on what the law is, not what the law should be. But I want to throw out to both of them because I mentioned it a couple times, and I think that is an important discussion to have. Both changes, either from a legislative point of view or changes that already exist within the statutory framework of how cities and towns and agencies can respond better to public record requests. Sheila?
I keep coming back to the consistency issue, and Tony used some examples and Tim used some examples of, and I agree, our reporters and my newspaper will work with agencies, especially when we know it's a voluminous request, and try to have that patience and work with them and pay the cost for the duplications and all of this stuff. But, you know, when Tony's using examples of, well, they know the people that come into town hall, or we have this with our own reporters. Our reporters go into town hall or into the police department that they're used to covering. They have a lot different response than an intern going in or a new person going in trying to get the same information. And I think that that's one of the things that's really been in the heart of the discussions about amending the public records law specifically, is providing an element of training so that, again, as was articulated earlier, everybody's treated the same. Whether you've, you know, we had a police reporter that covered Newport Police for 20 years, and she was getting phone calls at home when stuff was happening. Then when she's not doing Newport Police anymore, she's been promoted to city editor, the next person goes in and is not, does not have access to that information. And I understand there's a lot of relationship building, especially with reporters and with agencies, but when it comes to even things, as Tim was mentioning, about just kind of busting chops, you know, making people sit for a really long time to get the arrest reports in the morning, or, you know, just saying they don't have the information or the person isn't in. So I think that that's a big point that we've been trying to make, is that that there needs to be more awareness and more training so there's more consistency in responses. And the other element that we've really worked on in terms of amendments to the public records law has been, and you're all going to groan, shortening the time frame for responses. It's currently 10 days, and as particularly, but as has been mentioned in several examples, a lot of times that 10-day period is stretched all the way out to the 10 days, and then you respond with a denial. So it's shortening the time frame for response to 7 days is something that has been proposed. Other states have 3 days, 5 days, but that is one of the other areas, and a big area of concern, I think, especially for the Rhode Island Press Association, which I'm a member of, has been initial arrest reports, and I was very interested when Mike said face sheets and initial narratives are part of the public record, because that's a point of contention still. So those are areas that we've worked on to no success so far. A bill did pass the General Assembly and was vetoed by the governor a couple years ago.
Tim, I either want to put the same question to you, or in prior discussions we had talked about another topic here that mentioned earlier about things ending on my desk, and you and I certainly have one of those.
Yeah.
Whichever way you want to go for the last couple minutes.
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess overall for that example, I've had an issue with the interpretation of the law. I've disagreed several times with how the law is interpreted. I'm not an attorney, as Mike will tell you, because he's read my arguments. And that's right. That's the reason I lost, right? You know, I do think that by the time it gets to an attorney and whatnot, there's always, you know, they're always looking for the exclusion to the public records law. Agencies love to cite the fact that the records are identifiable to individuals and that they're exempt in there. That's written in there, and then it talks about what are some of the exceptions to that. You know, you could make that argument for, you know, when the governor signs a bill, his name is on it. So then under the public records law, it's exempt from disclosure. Fishing licenses, dog licenses, tax records, property tax records, those are all public, but they're not specifically listed in there. So the argument always has been, well, if it's not specifically listed as something that's public, then it's not, you know, then it's not public. Well, I can flip that argument around and say if it's not specifically listed as exempt, then it should be public. So that was the one main issue I've had with the interpretation. I'd like to see more fundamental changes to the legislation. And I saw Speaker Fox here, so if he's still here, I hope he's listening. But you know, journalism organizations in Rhode Island journalism organizations nationally consistently rate Rhode Island as one of the worst states in the country for public records laws, and it makes it difficult for journalists to obtain records. But you know what? It means it also makes it very difficult, and I'm a resident of this state, for members of the public to obtain records. And I don't feel that there is you talked about a balancing act in your presentation. I don't think there's a solid balancing act in Rhode Island as far as when the request comes in, if there's some consideration made in the federal public records laws, they always lean towards disclosure unless there's an unwarranted invasion of privacy. It's a lot tighter of a definition in our state laws, and that leaves really no balancing act. And I was really interested in the case that you brought up, where a judge was trying to ask, you know, the question of whether or not disclosing the records would show how a government operates. And it's the first time I've heard that, because I think that you really can look at particularly stuff that I've requested, and it shows how a government truly operates, and that balancing act is never applied unless I push it to the courts. And trust me, that takes money, you know, for our corporate lawyers to do that. And Ray Macaccio, who we work with a lot, who's a great guy and he knows his stuff very well. But you know, we're in tough economic times, and I don't always have that option to do. I'd like to see that balancing act further down the chain, because you know, John Doe and Jane Smith also may not have the energy to hire that attorney to appeal it if they disagree with Mike's findings. And by the way, I think Mike does a great job, even though I lost the case. It was very thorough, and Laura, they do a fantastic job. Connecticut handles it differently, and the only other change I'd like to see, and I don't want to see you out of work, but what happens when Mike becomes a judge and somebody else fills his shoes? You know, you don't know what you're going to get. And there's a commission in Connecticut that's appointed by the governor, but it's supposed to be a cross-section of society, including journalists, business, law enforcement, government. And they decide, when there's a complaint, they decide on whether or not this falls under public records. They have a better public records law, so there's a little more wiggle room. But I'd like to see something like that in Rhode Island, where it's not really a unilateral decision. And of course the argument always is, well, you can go to the courts.